I didn't mean to take it, he cried. I'll return it. I swear. Far away from the jungle, the people of Odu Village slept peacefully, unaware that something ancient had awakened again. The next morning, the village square buzzed with life. Women carried baskets of cassava, children chased one another between huts, and elders sat under the large baobab tree sharing stories. Tony sat beside his grandmother, listening quietly as she spoke with the other elders. I'm telling you, one old man said, tapping his walking stick on the ground. That jungle has never been safe. Our fathers warned us. Their fathers warned them too. Another elder nodded. The spirit protects that forest. Tony leaned closer. Grandmother, do you really believe the jungle spirit is real? His grandmother looked at him with a slow smile. You always ask too many questions, Tony. But I'm serious, he insisted. Nobody has ever seen it. One elder chuckled. Only fools try to see it. Tony crossed his arms. Stories are just stories. The elders exchanged looks. Tony, his grandmother said gently, some stories are warnings. Before he could reply, a loud noise interrupted the conversation. A truck rumbled into the village, kicking up clouds of dust. Everyone turned. 3 men stepped down from the truck. Their clothes were dusty from travel, and one of them carried a large metal detector. The tallest man walked forward confidently. Good morning, he called out. We are looking for the jungle temple. The entire village fell silent. The elders looked at one another nervously. There is no temple here, Tony's grandmother said firmly. The man smiled. Come on, old mother. We've heard the stories. An ancient temple in the jungle. Hidden treasure. Another villager shook his head quickly. You should leave. But the men laughed. Treasure doesn't belong to ghosts, one of them said. Tony watched them carefully. You're going into the jungle, he asked. The tallest man nodded. Of course. You shouldn't, Tony said quietly. The man crouched in front of him. Why? Are you afraid of bedtime stories? Tony didn't answer. The elder with the walking stick spoke again, his voice stern. That forest is sacred. Leave it alone. But the men were already walking back to their truck. We'll be back by nightfall, one of them shouted. Maybe we'll even bring your ghost with us. The truck roared away toward the jungle path. Silence settled over the village again. Tony looked at his grandmother. They won't listen, will they? She shook her head slowly. Some people only listen after the Digra sage is done. Later that afternoon, Tony sat with his friend Grace near the edge of the village. From where they sat, the jungle looked like a giant green wall stretching endlessly across the horizon. Grace tossed a small stone into the dirt. My mother says those men will disappear, she said. You believe that too? Tony asked. Grace shrugged. Don't you? Tony hesitated. I don't know. But you warned them. I just didn't want them causing trouble. Grace studied his face. You're curious about the jungle, aren't you? Tony smiled slightly. Maybe. Don't even think about it, she said quickly. If the elders find out. I'm not going in there, he said. At least, that's what he told himself. Evening slowly settled over Odu Village. The sky turned deep orange as the sun disappeared behind the distant hills. Villagers lit small fires outside their huts. The smell of roasted yam drifted through the air. But as darkness spread, people began noticing something strange. The truck had not returned. Tony sat beside his grandmother again, watching the jungle. They should have been back by now, he said. His grandmother said nothing. A nervous whisper moved through the villagers. They are lost. No one gets lost in that forest. Maybe the truck broke down. But then someone pointed toward the jungle. Look! Far in the distance, a faint light flickered between the trees. Another light appeared. Then another. Tony squinted. Are those lanterns? The elders stared silently. His grandmother's face suddenly tightened. No, she whispered. What is it? Tony asked. But before she could answer, a distant scream echoed from the jungle. The sound was so sharp and full of terror that every villager froze. Children clung to their parents. The scream came again. Then it stopped. The jungle went completely silent. Grace grabbed Tony's arm. Did you hear that? Yes. His grandmother stood slowly. The curse has begun, she said quietly. The villagers murmured anxiously. What curse? The jungle spirit. Tony felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. For the first time in his life, the stories didn't feel like stories anymore. The next morning, the entire village gathered near the jungle entrance. Nobody had slept much during the night. Tony stood near Grace, scanning the trees. What if they're hurt? He said. Grace shook her head. Nobody is going in there. Just then, a figure stumbled out of the jungle. People gasped. It was one of the treasure hunters. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and his hands trembled violently. Villagers rushed forward. What happened? Someone asked. The man tried to speak, but his voice cracked. The spirit, he whispered. Tony stepped closer. What spirit? The man grabbed his arm desperately. We took something from the shrine. His breathing grew frantic. It followed us. Tony's heart pounded. Where are the others? Grace asked. The man stared blankly at the jungle behind him. Gone. The crowd fell silent. What do you mean gone? Tony said. The man's eyes filled with fear. The forest took them. He collapsed onto the ground. As villagers rushed to help him, Tony slowly looked toward the jungle. The trees stood tall and silent, their shadows stretching deep into the forest. And for the first time, he felt something watching from within them. Something ancient. Something awake. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. Because what happened next in Odu Village would change everything forever. The injured man woke hours later inside the healer's hut. Tony sat outside on a wooden stool, staring at the jungle. The afternoon sun hung high in the sky, but the forest still looked dark, almost as if the light refused to enter it. Grace walked over and sat beside him. You've been here all day, she said. Tony shrugged. I'm waiting for him to talk again. You think he'll tell the truth? I think he's too scared to lie. Grace looked toward the healer's hut. My mother says the elders are meeting. They are, Tony said quietly. They think the spirit is angry. Grace sighed. Everyone thinks that. Just then, the door of the hut opened. The village healer stepped outside and nodded to Tony. He's awake, she said. Tony jumped up immediately and stepped inside. The injured man sat on a mat, his arm wrapped in leaves and cloth. His eyes were wide, as if he hadn't fully returned from whatever he had seen. Tony knelt beside him. You said you took something, he said gently. What was it? The man swallowed hard. A statue, he whispered. What kind of statue? It was small, carved from black stone. It was sitting in the middle of the shrine. Tony leaned closer. What happened after you took it? The man's hands began shaking again. At first nothing happened, he said. We laughed. We thought the villagers were just trying to scare us. Tony remained silent. The man continued. But when we started leaving, the forest changed. How? The wind stopped, he said. Everything became quiet. Too quiet. Tony felt a chill. One of my friends said he heard something walking behind us, the man continued. We thought it was an animal. Grace stepped inside quietly and listened. What was it? She asked. The man shook his head slowly. I don't know. But it was big. His breathing became uneven. Then the trees started moving. Tony frowned. Trees don't move. That's what I thought, the man said. But they did. The vines wrapped around our legs. Branches blocked the path. Grace whispered, the spirit. The man nodded. We started running. But the forest wouldn't let us leave. Tony's voice was steady. What happened to the others? The man's eyes filled with terror. One of them disappeared first, he said. We heard him scream, but when we turned around, he was gone. Grace covered her mouth. The second one dropped the statue, the man continued. He said we should leave it. Did you? Tony asked. The man shook his head. The tallest one picked it up again. He said we came too far to leave empty-handed. Tony clenched his fist. And then? Grace whispered. The man stared at the floor. Something stood in front of us. What did it look like? Tony asked. The man's voice dropped to a whisper. It looked like the forest itself. Tony waited. It was tall, made of vines and branches. Its eyes glowed like fire. Grace stepped back slowly. What did it say? Tony asked. The man looked at him. It said we had broken the sacred law. Silence filled the hut. Tony finally asked the question that had been growing in his mind. Where is the statue now? The man shook his head helplessly. I dropped it while running. Outside the hut, the elders' meeting had ended. Villagers gathered in small groups, speaking in worried voices. Tony stepped outside with Grace. Well, she asked. They took a statue from the shrine, Tony said. That's what made the spirit angry. Grace folded her arms nervously. So what happens now? I think the spirit wants it back. Grace stared at him. You're not thinking of going into the jungle, are you? Tony didn't answer. The oldest elder approached them slowly, leaning on his walking stick. Tony, he said. Yes, elder. We heard what the man said. Tony nodded. The spirit is angry because the shrine was disturbed, the elder continued. Then we should return the statue, Tony said. A few villagers nearby gasped. No one goes into that jungle, someone said. Grace nodded quickly. Exactly. But Tony looked at the elder. If nobody returns it, the curse will continue. The elder studied his face carefully. You are brave, he said. Grace shook her head. Or crazy. The elder sighed. When I was young, he said slowly, my grandfather told me something about that shrine. Tony leaned forward. What? The statue was not treasure, the elder said. It was a promise. What kind of promise? Grace asked. The promise that humans would respect the forest. Tony looked toward the jungle again. Then the spirit thinks we broke that promise. Yes, the elder said quietly. Grace turned to Tony. This is not our problem. Those men caused it. But the spirit doesn't know that, Tony said. The elder's voice grew softer. The forest spirit does not see individuals, he said. It sees humans. Grace sighed heavily. So what do we do? Tony answered before anyone else could. We return the statue. Grace stared at him. You keep saying we. Tony smiled slightly. You don't have to come. She rolled her eyes. You know I won't let you go alone. The elder looked at both of them. Young people rarely listen to warnings, he said. Tony said quietly, Sometimes warnings are meant to guide us, not stop us. The elder was silent for a long moment. Finally he said, "If you go, you must show the spirit respect." Tony nodded. "How?" "You must speak honestly," the elder replied. "Spirits know when humans lie." Grace whispered, "Great, no pressure." The elder placed his hand on Tony's shoulder. "Return the statue before nightfall. If darkness comes, the jungle becomes far more dangerous." Tony took a deep breath. "We'll find it." Grace groaned. "I can't believe I'm doing this." As they prepared to leave, villagers gathered around them. Some looked worried. Some looked hopeful. Tony's grandmother stepped forward slowly. "You always chase trouble," she said. Tony smiled nervously. "Not this time." She placed a small necklace around his neck. "This belonged to your grandfather," she said. "It will remind you who you are." Tony hugged her. "I'll come back." Grace whispered, "You better." The jungle path waited quietly ahead. Tony took the first step. Grace followed. Behind them, the villagers watched silently as the two young friends disappeared into the forest. And somewhere deep within the jungle, something ancient began to move again. If this story is keeping you hooked so far, take a moment to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Would you enter the jungle to face the spirit, or stay safely in the village? Because what Tony and Grace were about to discover inside that forest was far more terrifying than either of them imagined. The jungle closed around them the moment they stepped off the path. Tony pushed aside a thick branch and looked ahead. The air inside the forest felt heavier, almost like the trees were holding their breath. Grace walked close behind him. "I don't like this place," she muttered. Tony forced a small smile. "You liked it yesterday." "Yesterday I was looking at it from far away," she replied. "That was different." They walked deeper between the tall trees. Birds fluttered above them, but the deeper they went, the quieter everything became. Grace noticed it first. "Tony, do you hear that?" "Hear what?" "Nothing." He stopped. She was right. No birds. No insects. No wind. The jungle was completely silent. Grace grabbed his arm. "That's not normal." Tony tried to stay calm. "Maybe the animals are hiding." "From what?" He didn't answer. They kept walking. After several minutes, Grace pointed at something on the ground. "Tony, look." Half buried in the dirt was a boot. Tony knelt beside it. The leather was torn and covered with mud. "One of the treasure hunters," he said quietly. Grace looked around nervously. "Maybe we should turn back." Tony stood slowly. "We are close." "How do you know?" He pointed ahead. Through the trees, ancient stone pillars rose from the ground, covered in vines and moss. "The shrine," he said. Grace swallowed hard. "Okay, we find the statue, we return it, and we leave." "Exactly." They stepped into the clearing. In the center stood the shrine. It was old and cracked, but the carvings on the stone still showed strange symbols of trees, animals, and spirits. Grace whispered, "This place feels alive." Tony noticed something scattered across the ground. Broken equipment. A torn backpack. The metal detector. But there were no bodies. Grace stepped closer to the shrine. "Tony," she said quietly. "What?" "I think I see it." Near the base of the shrine, partially hidden by leaves, lay a small black statue. Tony walked toward it slowly. "Don't touch it yet," Grace said quickly. "Why not?" "What if that's what makes the spirit appear?" Tony looked around the clearing. "Maybe that's exactly what we need." He picked up the statue. It was heavier than it looked, carved into the shape of a tall figure with vines twisting around its body. The moment Tony lifted it, the wind suddenly rushed through the clearing. Grace jumped. "Did you feel that?" Tony nodded
From the far
slowly.
side of the clearing, something
Then a
tall
deep
stepped
voice
forward.
echoed through
It was
the forest.
enormous. Its
"You
eyes glowed
returned.
like fire.
What was taken?" Grace froze. "Tony." The trees began to move. Vines slid slowly across the ground like living snakes. From the far side of the clearing, something tall stepped forward. It was enormous. Its body looked like it had grown from the forest itself. Branches formed its arms, vines wrapped around its torso, and glowing eyes burned within a face made of bark and roots. Grace whispered, "The spirit." Tony stepped forward slowly, holding the statue with both hands. "We came to return it," he said. The spirit's voice rumbled like thunder. "Humans broke the sacred promise." Tony nodded. "Yes. But not all humans." The spirit leaned closer. "Why should the forest believe you?" Grace whispered nervously, "Tony, say something good." Tony took a deep breath. "The men who took this didn't respect the forest," he said. "But our village has protected this jungle for generations." The spirit was silent. Tony continued. "We came to fix their mistake." Grace added quickly, "And we almost got eaten by vines on the way here." Tony shot her a quick look. The spirit's glowing eyes shifted toward the statue. "Return it." Tony stepped forward and gently placed the statue back on the shrine. The moment it touched the stone, the wind stopped. Light slowly spread through the clearing. The vines that had crept across the ground pulled back into the forest. Grace exhaled. "Is that a good sign?" The spirit spoke again. "The promise is restored." Tony felt relief wash over him. "So, the curse is over." The spirit looked toward the jungle. "The forest remembers respect." Grace whispered, "I think that means yes." The spirit's form began slowly fading into the trees. But before it disappeared completely, it spoke one last time. "Guard the forest, as your ancestors promised." Then it was gone. The clearing became quiet again, but this time the silence felt peaceful. Birds began singing. Sunlight broke through the branches above. Grace sat down on a rock and laughed nervously. "I can't believe we just talked to a jungle spirit." Tony smiled. "At least it didn't eat us." Grace stood up. "Let's go home before it changes its mind." They walked back through the jungle, and this time the forest felt different. The air was lighter, and the path seemed easier to follow. When the trees finally opened and Odu Village came into view, people ran toward them. "Tony." "Grace." Villagers surrounded them. "What happened? Did you find it?" Tony nodded. "We returned the statue." The oldest elder stepped forward slowly. "And the spirit?" Grace smiled. "It accepted the apology." Relief spread across the crowd. Tony's grandmother hugged him tightly. "I knew you would come back." That evening, the village gathered around a large fire. Laughter returned, and children played again. The jungle in the distance looked calm and peaceful. Grace nudged Tony. "You know people are going to tell stories about this forever." Tony shrugged. "Maybe the stories will remind people to respect the forest." The elder raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Today the promise between our village and the forest has been renewed." The villagers cheered. Tony looked toward the dark outline of the jungle. Somewhere inside, he knew the ancient spirit was still watching. But this time, it was not watching with anger. It was watching with trust. And that trust would protect the village for generations to come. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have been brave enough to enter the jungle and face the ancient spirit? And remember, sometimes the scariest legends are not meant to frighten us. They exist to remind us of promises we should never break.